Alright, now that we've finished discussing the fixed factory overhead and the variable factory overhead as part of the direct material and the direct labor discussion earlier, we now proceed to analyzing the total factory overhead, right? So as also mentioned earlier, the analysis of total factory overhead is much more complicated than the others in the sense that we are now dealing with costs with two different natures, right? So one is variable and one is fixed. However, we can still have some way on how to analyze these on a combined basis, right? So lifting from our discussions earlier, we can plot in our diagram or in our analysis both variable and fixed overhead. So we can have variable overhead here, wherein we have the three figures, right, that we've discussed earlier. So we can have here the actual the actual total variable overhead, and then this total standard variable overhead to the right side, right? And then if you could remember, we also inserted a middle figure here, which multiplies the actual time multiplied by the standard rate, okay? And then if we would be trying to combine it with the fixed overhead, we can just plot the fixed overhead at the bottom portion. And then to be able to, combine the two concepts together, we can plot actual fixed overhead right at the bottom of the standard total of the total standard variable overhead, which means that we would be adding these two amounts. And then we proceed to the budgeted fixed overhead here, and then lastly to the standard fixed overhead to the rightmost portion. Okay, so if you could notice, we have the standard variable overhead here, and we have the standard fixed overhead here, right? We have the actual fixed overhead here, and then we have the actual variable overhead here, right? Now, if we were be trying to combine these two amounts, we can extend the variable costs at the upper portion of the fixed overhead amounts, and then we could also try to extend the fixed overhead amounts to the left side, right? So at the bottom of the variable overhead amounts, right? So given the current plotting of our analysis or of our graphical diagram here, I would like also to point out that at this point we can already see that the leftmost portion here, if you add these two together, is actually the total factory overhead. Okay, this is the total actual factory overhead. And then if we go to the rightmost portion here, these two are both the standard variable and the standard fixed. So that also provides us the total standard factory overhead. All right, so within these two total amounts, we already have the two components which we are trying to analyze, right? There you go. So again, we have the total and the standard, right? So again, similar analysis before, we would be trying to go from left to right in our analysis, right? Now, if we proceed to the next step of the analysis, if you could notice here, the fixed actual overhead stays the same, okay, in these first two total amounts. And then if we try to analyze the variable, again similarly, the actual time stays the same, whereas the actual rate and standard rate differs. So overall, if we compare these first two figures, we would arrive at the difference in the rates, right, from the variable overhead. So if we try to deduct this figure from this amount, we can already arrive at the variable spending variance. Okay, so it's very important to analyze that which factor is actually the one which is differing from the figures which we're trying to analyze, right? So similarly, if we try to get the difference between the second and the third amounts, we would arrive at the variable efficiency variance, right? So notice here, the fixed overhead stays the same, the standard rate stays the same. What actually changes is the standard time versus the actual time, right? So that would pertain to the difference between the time used in production so far as variable overhead is concerned, right? And then if we proceed to the next step, look at in our analysis, if you could try to notice again, standard rate, standard rate, standard time does not differ. However, when we look at the fixed overhead, actual versus budgeted, so same analysis, we arrive at the fixed spending variance or the budget variance. And then if we try to go to the next step, again, we try to compare budgeted versus the standard fixed overhead. Variable overhead remains the same. So we arrive at the volume or capacity variance. All right? So again, it's kind of more complicated in the sense that we are now looking at both variable and fixed overhead simultaneously, right? But don't be confused. As what we've already shown, we can reliably, break the components down to its variances, right? And given the 4 variances which we've noted here, we can now proceed to analyzing the different, approaches in the more common problems you would be encountering in standard costing. Okay. Now, if we go further, we could add these first 3 items together to arrive at the controllable variance. And then we could just bring down the volume or capacity variance as is to provide further analysis, right? So controllable variance means that these are sort of the variances wherein the production supervisor has some sort of control over their incurrence, right? So as compared with the volume or capacity variance, as we've discussed in the previous slide, it is the least likely variance which can be controllable by the production supervisor. Another way to look at this is that the controllable variance pertains to the production inputs, so far as factory overhead is concerned, whereas volume or capacity variance pertains to the production outputs. Okay? And then same analysis, if we try to add or combine the variances, we arrive at the total factory overhead variance. All right? Now, the 3 analysis which we will be discussing now would be just some way of the ways wherein these 4 variances are presented, right? So different combination of the same amounts would lead to different analysis and presentations, right? But basically the concept remains the same. It's just a different wording or a different terminology, right? So don't be confused. So first method of analyzing this is through the 4-way analysis, which is just basically listing down all of the variances we've computed here, right? So variable spending, variable efficiency, fixed spending, and volume or capacity. Next way of analyzing all of these is through the 3-way analysis, which has spending variance, which has a variable or fixed component. Here they are. And secondly, we have the efficiency variance, which only pertains to variable factory overhead. We won't be having any efficiency variances or any efficiency analysis with regard to fixed overhead, right? And then lastly here we have the volume variance, which is basically, again, the difference between standard fixed and budgeted fixed. And then next here and last way of analyzing these is through the 2-way analysis, which we've discussed earlier. Again, if we break this down into the 2 main categories, we have controllable and volume or capacity variance. Now, let's proceed to a sample problem which combines variable overhead and fixed overhead. Alright? Alright, so for this problem, a company has the following standard factory overhead costs. Variable overhead, 3 hours at 15 pesos per hour leads to 45 pesos per unit. Fixed overhead, 3 hours at 5 per hour leads to 15 pesos per unit. Actual factory overhead costs for 1,100 units produced are as follows. Variable overhead, 3,250 hours at 14.5 pesos per hour leads to 47,125 pesos. Fixed overhead, which is just given 16,000 pesos, right? Now, at the bottom portion here, total budgeted fixed overhead is 15,000 pesos. This is for budgeted production, the normal capacity level of 1,000 units, requiring total budgeted time of 3,000 hours, right? So again, as we've discussed at the beginning portions of our topic, we mentioned that the budgeted or the normal capacity level or budgeted costs can either be given as a total amount. So in this case, it is given as 15,000 pesos. But in some instances, it is not given, and we should try to arrive at the total budgeted cost using the per unit or per hour information given, right? So this 15,000 pesos can actually also be arrived at when we try to analyze the other given. So total budgeted production or the normal capacity is 1,000 units, right? Requiring total budgeted time of 3,000 hours. So we can arrive at 15,000 similarly as the fixed budgeted overhead by getting the total budgeted time of 3,000 hours and multiplying that by 5 per hour. Right? So that gives us the same amount of 15,000. So the problem might as well did not include this amount. We could still, arrive at the total budgeted fixed overhead. All right? So that's that. The required analysis for us is to analyze the total factory overhead into its different variances. Okay. Now we can present this more simply into its components by following our previous analysis. Okay. So from actual factory overhead at the left, we go to the standard total factory overhead to the right, and then we break it into its components, variable and fixed. Okay. So let's just first plot the total factory overhead here to keep things simple. So variable, let's go back to the given. Let's go to the actual cost, okay? So since the total here is already given, we could plot these two amounts in these two first figures, okay? Right, so very simple, we just plot them. And then we could go ahead and compute for the standard rate multiplied by the actual time for the variable overhead. Okay, so let's go back to the problem. So the standard rate given is 15 per hour, right? And the actual time is 3,250 hours. So we could get our figure or continue our analysis by multiplying these two amounts. Okay. So 15 times 3,250 gives us 48,750. All right. And then we could also proceed to plot the actual fixed overhead at the bottom portion. Again, it remains 16,000. Then afterwards, we could continue to provide or to compute for the total standard variable factory overhead. Okay. So let's just go back to the problem. Let's get the standard rate per hour and the total standard hours allowed for actual production. All right. So standard rate per hour remains at 15 for variable. But to be able to compute for the standard hours allowed for actual production, we get the actual production of 1,100 units, and then we get how much time is the standard hours for this total production for variable. Okay, so that means that we get the 3 hours here, which would provide us the standard hours allowed for actual production. Okay, so 3 hours multiplied by 1,100 units gives us 3,300 hours. All right, so to continue our analysis, let's just clear up the slide here. Standard rate remains at 15, and the standard time is 3,300 hours. Okay, gives us 49,500 total standard factory overhead. Actual fixed remains the same, and then we can now proceed to analyze the variable component. If we deduct these two figures, we arrive at 1,625 favorable case variable spending variance because we spent less than what is the actual time at standard rates, right? And then we could also proceed to analyze the variable efficiency variance, which is 750 favorable. Favorable because we have a less Favorable because the standard rates multiplied by actual time is less than the standard rate times the standard time, right? So this means that in terms of the time used in production, we actually used less, okay, than what was expected. Okay, so that's the variable component. And then now we could proceed to analyze the fixed component. So in doing so, we can extend the total standard variable factory overhead to the right. And then we could go ahead and compute for the total budgeted fixed overhead, right? But as we've already discussed earlier, let's just go back to the previous slide. The total budgeted fixed overhead is already given, right? But we could as well compute for it using the analysis we mentioned earlier, right? So if you go back here, after we've plotted the budgeted fixed overhead of 15,000, we could already, analyze the fixed spending variance, right? But just to continue the analysis, we could still extend the variable factory overhead to the right, and then now compute for the standard fixed overhead. Okay, so as we discussed earlier, standard fixed overhead is also the standard cost applied to actual production, which means we should also try to get the total hours allowed for actual production in terms of standard fixed overhead, right? So if we go back to the previous slide, let's try to go back to the previous slide. Here, here, it's the same, right? It's 3 hours for fixed overhead, right? So we multiply that similarly with 1,100 actual units produced, which would also give us 3,300 units standard fixed overhead allowable for actual production, right? Let's just clear up the slide. So same, multiply the standard fixed overhead rate by 3,300 hours gives us 16,500 hours, okay? So to continue the analysis, we could just get the fixed spending variance, which is 1,000 unfavorable. Okay, unfavorable because again, the actual fixed is greater than the budgeted fix, leads to overspending, which leads to an unfavorable variance. Then we could also proceed to analyze the volume or capacity variance by deducting these two amounts, which leads to 1,500 favorable this time of a volume capacity variance. Okay, because this means that the budgeted fixed overhead is less than the standard fixed overhead, applied to actual production. So another analysis which we could do for volume or capacity variance, again, we mentioned earlier that if the plant is overutilized, it would lead us to a favorable variance, right? Because we've been able to utilize the plant exceeding its budgeted capacity, which of course may also exist because budgeted capacity or normal capacity provides for normal downtime, which still has an allowance of overutilization. So in this sense, or so in this case, since we have a favorable variance here based on our computation, we would also expect that the normal or budgeted capacity is less than the actual hours or the capacity allowed for actual production, right? So let's try to see if that's correct. If you go back to the previous slide, total budgeted time is 3,000 hours, whereas the total hours allowed for actual production is 3,300, right? So we actually exceeded the budgeted time, which leads us to a favorable variance, volume variance, right? So our analysis remains correct, right? Right, now to proceed with the further analysis, we could add this first three to arrive at the controllable variance of 1,375 favorable. And we could carry over the volume or capacity variance into the same amount, right? And then if we add the total factory overhead variance here, we arrive at 2,875 favorable, right?